Because we all seem to think this is normal. It's normalization of deviance. These are the types of things that create space shuttle crashes and plane crashes because we accept these things as normal, as, it's just, it's what we got to do. They're not normal. None of these things are normal because none of these companies really went in to understand the processes. And when we look at Trendelenburg, I only need a little bit of Trendelenburg to move my internal organs away so my camera gets a good view.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with David Gomez, CRNA and also CEO and CTO at Infinitus Medical Technologies, LLC. And Paul, throughout your years of consulting, I know that patient positioning is something that is literally part of your every single day life, no matter what role you've had. And, something that we're going to be talking about with David today is related to some of the physics and design considerations around positioning, but also really some statistics that are going to shock everybody about falls and compartment syndrome and many other potential complications related to improper patient positioning. And I think it's something that everybody just kind of lives through every day, but we're going to really have a focused conversation with David today. And I think it'll either illuminate things that we all know are going on or maybe shine a new light.
Well, Justin, over the years, 40 years in the operating room, I'm not going to get by without seeing a positioning injury. And, whether it's a drop foot or an eye injury or a problem with the upper extremity, these things happen and it's unfortunate and we have to do everything we can to prevent it. And, over the years, people use rolled towels or sandbags or bean bags, all different kinds of devices to try and keep the patient safe. It's certainly far from perfect. So I'm really anxious to hear what David has to say about this and to give us some information in terms of where things are going now and in the future and what the issues are. In the physics part of it, I haven't got a clue. So I'm really interested in learning more about that as well.
All right. Well, stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with David Gomez, Chief Executive Officer and Chief Technical Officer at Infinitus Medical Technologies, LLC.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Perry.
I'm Jeremy Gibson-Rohr.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is David Gomez, CRNA and CEO, CTO at Infinitus Medical Technologies, LLC. And David, you got connected with Paul. And then you kind of shared a presentation with me, and I can't wait to see you do one live, because just by looking at the flow of the presentation, I could just see how well you share this information with the industry. And so we're going to be talking about patient positioning today, and I'm so excited to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me and the honor and the privilege of being on your show, and congrats on what you guys are doing out there.
Yeah, I can't believe we're almost at the end of year one. It's quite amazing. The time has passed that fast. David, why don't you just talk about your background and then maybe even, some of the things you saw in the industry that led you to take on the role that you have now as the CEO and CTO at Infinitus Medical.
Okay. I've been a nurse anesthetist for about 18 years, graduated from Texas Wesleyan University in 2003. worked in a variety of operating room environments, from large urban level 2 trauma centers to specialty hospitals and even some rural critical access facilities. Performed many anesthetics across, everything from hearts, neuro, OB, just pretty much everything that we currently do in the general surgical field. But, one of the things that kind of got me down the road from an entrepreneurial perspective is, obviously, other than taking care of patients, we have a lot of time to sit there and kind of ponder and watch what everybody's doing in the room. And in the last 20 years, when we look at advanced robotic platforms and orthopedic platforms and things that we're subjecting our patients to in terms of gravity dependent positioning, one of the things that really gets missed in the industry is patient positioning and patient handling go hand in hand. And after sitting there and watching everyone struggle and stuff over the years, I was putting my thinking cap on and try to figure out a way to improve those things so we can kind of balance that safety, because we're always talking about patient safety, but rarely do we ever talk about provider safety in performing some of these methodologies and processes that we do for patient handling and positioning.
Yeah, that's such a good point. If it's unsafe for the patient, why wouldn't we think that it might also be unsafe for the staff?
Correct. It's that imbalance that creates, we try to preserve patient safety and at the same time try to preserve provider safety. Those two don't always go hand in hand. And we can talk through those here in a few minutes. But, one of the things that we're really passionate about is, say, for instance, Trendelenburg. A lot of people don't really understand, how surgical tables or even infrastructure can alter how we do most of these processes of patient handling. And so, when we look at lithotomy required positions, for example, some surgical tables have a 45-inch torso section minus the headpiece. Well, that means that someone has to move that patient down to lithotomy. And no one ever talks about how that patient gets down there. We see it in all these products that are out there, and you go to their websites or you see their literature and it shows this really thin patient on this table, several inches down there. They never really show larger patients, which is kind of 40% of our population. And the processes that are involved in moving that creates complexities for us because they don't want to lift and move those patients by hand and sheet off surfaces that are meant to hold them in place because they have to physically lift them. So what they'll do is they'll create shortcuts to keep them safe by positioning patients further down the table and then expect anesthesia to manage that airway 7 to 14 or even more inches away, which creates all kinds of issues, especially for your larger patients because you're really worried about managing that airway effectively and having a good mask seal, making sure they don't desaturate because they're going to desaturate faster because of closing capacities and vital capacity and all that kind of stuff, that we could really get into, but it's not really important, but it's really about processes. And I want that patient's airway really close to me from a laryngoscopy perspective, so we can get that tube in as fast as we can, especially during COVID, because obviously, all these aerosols are going to create a risk for everyone in the room. So managing that airway, especially today, is even more important.
You really talked a lot about what's going on right now, but what were you seeing, just even more beyond that throughout the industry, working on the front lines that led you to become an entrepreneur? Because, I realize we're talking about a specific area now, but I think there was a general theme as you and I were talking leading up to the interview of just how these products were developed, how they were perceived by the front lines, and really just made you say, wait a second, I need to get involved in the development of products. I need to become an entrepreneur to help have a positive impact.
Yeah. So again, if we talk about things like Trendelenburg positioning, and we can talk about pressure management and all that kind of stuff, but all of these are process-based, and everybody's all over the map because there's different constraints. There's cost constraints, obviously. There's normalization of deviance and groupthink restraints where people do something and they don't know why. It's kind of one of the things that we've always done. But a lot of manufacturers have failed to really go into the operating room and watch the processes that we are performing in order to optimize those products, because today's products should facilitate processes of care for especially high reliability processes of care, so we can reduce that variance that will lead to injury and slipping and all those things that we really worry about. I got tired of seeing everybody use tape and towels, gel and foam and more tape and diapers and plastic sleds and all these types of things that, everybody would say, well, we saved, $5 or $10 because I hand cut this foam. But at the same time, it took you 15 to 20 minutes to position your patients. And there was no process behind it. And in most facilities, honestly, if they're doing that kind of stuff, patient positioning, especially if you're choosing a product, is kind of a shared liability, which means if you're doing everything correctly based on how the product is supposed to be used, if there's an injury, the hospital has some leverage in order from a liability perspective. If you're doing everything and there's really no rhyme or reason, or there's no protocol in place of doing the same thing each and every time, especially across a large patient spectrum of, say, for instance, BMI, body mass index, then it really creates issues with accountability that, from a legal perspective is not really, it's not going to work out for you in case something happens, because there was no real standardized process behind that.
You mentioned BMI and bringing up, our larger patient population that we see very often in the operating room. Can you talk some more about the limitations you see with positioning devices and positioning our patients when we're dealing with that larger patient population?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind. When we look at surgical tables, surgical tables are the same as they've always been. They have higher weight capacities now, but they're still only 20 inches wide. When we look at, using bariatric extenders, for example, where we can expand the table to, I think up to 27 inches. Some of them have rail structures, some of them don't. One of the things that you really worry about is if the more from a physics perspective, again, this is not really marketing, but from a physics perspective, and we know this for a fact because we have some of our representatives who work for major table companies where they're always having to repair the rails. If you apply something and then you put something heavy on it further from the main rail, it's going to bow the system. And so it becomes very ineffective. And we never really see people, say, for instance, use bariatric extenders to widen a table where they're putting, say, for instance, stirrups on. Because one of the things we worry about with obese patients is if my table's only 20 to 21 inches wide, my rail span is only about 21 to 23 inches wide. So if I have to put stirrups on or fixed post retractors, most of the time it's going to set close to the patient's skin. And a lot of people have this misnomer that if I pat it, it's going to be okay. Well, that's not really true, because if there's sustained pressure, even if it's padded, if I push down on your skin, it only takes about 32 millimeters of mercury or 0.6 pounds of sustained pressure, even if it's padded, to stop capillary blood flow on the skin and start the ischemic process. And then we worry about when we tuck the patient's arms when they're hanging off the table, because we don't, again, use bariatric extenders effectively. So when they're hanging off the table, it increases the risk for brachial plexus injury. They have to tighten that sheet really hard, because the standards is to use a sheet, lay it under the patient, roll it around the arms, and then back under the patient using the patient's weight to hold the tension. And that can create, anything from compartment syndromes, because the arms are going to be completely restricted. We're not going to have access from an anesthesia perspective to gain access to IVs or arterial lines or anything like that, because we'd have to pull everything out from under the patient. And then when we look at using those guidelines that we're supposed to use, using that sheet to tuck the arms, especially with a larger patient, if I have to hold that patient in, say, for instance, Trendelenburg, any degree of head up or down or even lateral, I'm relying on some type of friction surface coefficient in order to create that friction that holds them in place. And that can be, we see foam, we see gel, we see all kinds of stuff. If the premise of foam and gel is a high friction, and gel is only a high friction surface area when it's dry. Once it gets wet, it's hydrophobic, which means all the sweat and the blood or any fluids that get up underneath that will create a water slide. So you have a slip differential. If you've got a draw sheet on top of any of those, you're going to reduce the effective pad to skin contact surface that you're relying on from 40 to 80%. So you're already undermining the process of positioning those patients and holding them in high degrees of Trendelenburg.
So do you think the current design is even really accommodating the demographics of the patient population? Even not when we're talking about the larger patients, like Melanie said, I'm just saying the general population at large.
I think there's design improvements. Again, design must go with processes. If I'm having to strap a pad, say, for instance, like we talked earlier about a 45-inch torso section, say, for instance, on a Trump table. And I'll use the name because you can go out and measure it, and that is what it is. And it's just an example. But the average sitting height of a human being from the top of your head to your sacrum is only 34 to 36 inches. So if you do the math, 34 and 36 versus 45, that is going to tell you the distance that you must physically lift and move your patient, or the distance that anesthesia will have to reach in order to intubate that patient if they're pre-positioning that down. And that's only because when we look at things like bean bags or even foam or gel systems, they're always going to tape them at the distal end of the table when lithotomy is required, because that's where it's going to sit. So you can go online and you can look at all of these products and look at what they're due, but you'll always notice that that pad is set further down the table because it's non-modular. It doesn't move. So by nature, they're expecting staff to lift heavy patients physically off those surfaces. And the instructions for use for a lot of these foam pads literally say that you must lift its entirety off the pad in order to move them down, because it'll bunch the pad, it'll rip the pad, it'll do all kinds of stuff to the pad that's unnatural. And so, that's why we've been forced to create kind of these workaround processes that try to keep staff safe, but it can undermine patient safety at the same time.
So, David, you're talking about positioning on a regular table, but what about some of these specialty tables now? Do you see those as being more effective or less effective in terms of helping with patient injury? Like, for example, a Jackson table for spine cases or Hanna table for anterior hip. What kind of experience do you see with those?
Yeah, so when we look at prone positioning, we're not into prone positioning, but I know a lot about prone positioning and eye injuries and all those things that happen, and you can still get injuries related to those. Those try to keep up to the best. I think we see a lot of improvements with those, especially the spine tables and all the products that are meant to improve that, all the bolsters for the chest. I don't think any of us have figured out how to create something that allows that abdominal distension, especially for larger patients or even females with breast tissue, when we're down like this way, because you can do everything possibly as safety wise as you can. You can pad everything, you can do all those things, but it's really degree and duration of surgery that is going to increase the risk, even despite the best circumstances. So from a perspective of spine tables, I think a lot of them, especially if we're flipping and we're doing all kinds of stuff. Now, I will say that we do see some really interesting patient handling technologies in Europe. A lot of good things come from Europe and eventually come over here, or the companies over here will kind of squash them and keep them from coming over here. But we're starting to see some really cool things over there that help them get their patients from a lateral perspective. I know Allen Medical, Hillrom, they've got a spine table that really kind of focuses on lateral positioning, because we're doing these lateral procedures, and then we put them prone or we put them supine, whatever we're going to do, or we, somewhere in the middle. And then they've got those systems that will sandwich a patient and help turn them over. And those are, again, process oriented. You want to make sure you're doing everything to keep those patients safe. When we look at tables like anterior hip tables, one of the things we also worry about is exposure, because a lot of these anterior hip tables narrow down towards the base, or where we're going to provide that post and provide that distraction. That post is serving for a distraction, fulcrum distraction. And we can talk about that at another podcast. But, anterior hips are a little bit different, but the table can impact, especially with larger patients, can impact the stability of the patients because it's so narrow at the end. So you always want to make sure that, you have something effectively, that you've got a strap on your patient. You want to make sure that post is put on during very key times of the surgery. There are some facilities out there doing a postless distraction. And, that's pretty cool if you're worried about perineal injuries. But when we look at the literature, there is a degree of perineal injury. Again, even though those things are pressured, you've got a straddle pressure. If I cut my hand, my first index finger and my thumb around a can, you're going to see a straddle pressure. So it doesn't matter how padded this is. If I'm pulling against this, my genitals have nowhere to go. That 0.6 pounds of force, as we talked, can create the ischemic process, especially for genitalia. The pulling can create pudendal nerve injuries, those types of things. But there are some new technologies out there that are thinking about some of these and at the same time also improving patient handling from a perspective. Because, and I know I'm being long-winded here, but those tables are so narrow that we can't do like other tables from an anesthesia perspective. I can't put a spinal in on that table. I can't go to sleep on that table because it's too narrow. And people rarely use the little part that goes on the end of the table in order to do that. All of that work is usually done on the stretcher, and then we move the patient over. So there are ways to improve every one of those processes.
So, David, we've talked a lot about the physics and kind of design considerations or even limitations, really. But what we didn't talk about is how all that relates to industry standards and recommended practices. So can you talk a little bit about how that also influences physics and design, or, what are some best practices and recommendations that are in the industry that should always be considered?
Well, when we look at things like arm adduction, or we look at what everybody's currently doing, say, for instance, with the sheet, rolling patients back and forth, that's kind of the standard. So one of the things I'll do, for instance, is we'll talk about arm adduction. So if you look at the AORN standards for arm adduction, it basically says the patient's arms should not be tucked at his or her sides when positioned in a supine position unless it is necessary for surgical reasons. There is an increased risk for tissue injury, compartment syndrome in the upper extremities when the patient's arms are tucked tightly at his or her sides, things that we discussed, right? There are increased risks for interference with physiological monitoring, blood pressure, arterial monitoring, SpO2, all those things that we worry about from an anesthesia perspective. If the patient's arms are not tucked tightly enough, there's a risk for them to become unsecure during the procedure. Aligning the patient properly, redistributing pressure, protecting the patient from tissue and nerve injuries, preserving IV access and physiological monitoring, and providing appropriate exposure for the procedure are all important considerations for safe, effective positioning. Those are all good things. It's kind of a mea culpa at the same time, but all the products that are designed, especially for like Trendelenburg foam pads or whatever, where they're using a sheet, they're kind of following this whole process if you look at the diagram of using that sheet to go back. I think a lot of these have really failed to understand, especially from a perspective of, historic processes. We're not accounting for that 40% obesity. We're not accounting for the greater degrees of Trendelenburg that we're doing for procedures, And some of these tables do 45. You should never do 45. There's a lot of literature that says a mean of 18 degrees is all you really need, because it creates far more, and we'll discuss that with falls. It creates far more complications, physiological and liability complications. So there is a way to do all of these procedures, and all the research out there shows it. So more is not better when it comes to Trendelenburg. But we also rotate our patients laterally, and you want to make sure that you hold that. And say, for instance, if I wrap the arms with a sheet and I rotate the patient towards that side where the arms are wrapped, that sheet is going to tighten on the dependent side. And that will increase the risk for tissue injury, nerve injury, and compartment syndrome. And the reason why is in a gravity-dependent position, as we'll discuss again a little later, that arm is going to swell for a lot of reasons. It's going to naturally third space from the anesthetic. It's going to naturally third space and get edema from being in a lateral position and a down position, because that's where the blood flow is going. There's going to be less arterial blood flowing in and out. And we can talk about compartment syndromes all day, the upper and lower extremities, but all of these are real things. And if we have anything like an unseen IV that gets infiltrated due to that hydrostatic pressure getting greater than the vessel itself and then rupturing, then you're going to have all kinds of issues as it relates to that patient getting by. We don't have to do skin grafts or anything like that because we're running medications through there. So all of these things they really do go hand in hand.
You talked about, all these things are real things. And something else that's a real thing is falls. And I actually think Paul has a story. and Paul, I'll let you go ahead and share it as we kind of tee up this part of the conversation around falls.
Well, it had to do with the HANA table. And as a consultant, I usually go in and observe in the operating room to see their processes. And I literally had to catch a patient that was starting to fall off the HANA table as they were doing their timeout. I mean, they had gotten the patient on the table, but they didn't do it correctly. And if I hadn't stepped in and grabbed that patient, the patient would have ended up on the floor.
And those things seem to happen a lot. And that's why, processes and being mindful, having the correct number of staff in there, making sure that everybody's paying attention to the patient. And honestly, putting that post on as quickly as possible and securing that patient is really what's going to help. Because, a lot of these patients, especially for the HANA table, we do a lot of those procedures under spinal or even epidural or a combined technique. So that way they're kind of still awake, but we're sedating them. And that makes it more dangerous because we really can't control if they break through some of that sedation in order to move, and only their upper extremities are going to move. And, we see that when I do, labor and delivery, when we do C-sections, we'll do a spinal and the mom can't move anything, from her chest down, but she'll certainly move. And if that patient moves so much and you're not really watching her, she becomes top heavy and the rest of her body will go with them. And we've all, from an anesthesia perspective, all of us providers have had these near misses, and you really have to be cognizant of making sure that you're really paying attention to the patient. But yeah, so, when we look at falls, it's kind of a crazy thing. We have a lot of clients who have had sentinel events. It happens more than most people know. As I said earlier, when we did a survey across all the nurse anesthetists on our social network sites out there, they equated those about 4%. The American Society of Anesthesiologists had done a study where it equated falls from Trendelenburg-related procedures around 8%. And that was behind facial edema, which was 36%, obviously, because gravity-dependent edema. Brachial plexus injuries, 15%, because we worry about, when we look at positioning, especially for head and shoulder systems, when we go in Trendelenburg, the larger a patient is, it's like Jell-O. Your bones are going to move around your skin. So like rubbing the back of your hand, you've got 2 to 4 inches of skin play here. Imagine that on a larger patient. So when they transition to Trendelenburg, it doesn't mean they're necessarily sliding on something, but the straps and everything that's supposed to hold them in place, their body is going to settle until they stop. And that settling has inertia behind it. And that inertia can create compression. It can create brachial plexus stretching. So if the head is moving and then we've got something against the shoulders and my head is still moving, but my shoulders aren't, I'm going to get a stretch and I'm going to get a brachial plexus injury. And the longer I'm going to surgery, that is going to be there. So outside of that, from a fall perspective, one American Society of Anesthesiology closed claim study stated falls at 1.2% retrospectively from 2000. In 2007, the Massachusetts Health and Human Services director was he was speaking at a lawsuit that was going in relation to a patient fall. And again, I believe you guys are going to have my lecture on your show notes so people can look these stats up. I mean, they're all legitimate stats and there's links, but he had stated that a surgical table falls were at about 400 to 500 per year, just in his state alone. And a lot of people don't know, if you're a big baseball fan, Paul, if Warren Spahn, great pitcher, Warren Spahn died from falling off a surgical table in Oklahoma. We actually talked to the underwriter who wrote the check for the hospital at one time. So it happens a lot. And, we have a lot of clients where it happens. It happens for many reasons. Again, these workaround processes where people will try to put like these blow up devices underneath foam pads and try to keep them there. It's bad because those hover devices are great for lateral to lateral transfer, but they're low friction coefficient surface areas. So when they're against the mattress or something, they're meant to slide really easy. And if you look at a foam pad is meant to be in contact with the table because you want that friction coefficient against the table. And you also want maximum pad to skin contact with the patient as a friction coefficient. So you're holding that patient in stability in two areas. If you undermine that by putting a draw sheet, because some people will actually put draw sheets underneath the foam pad because they're trying to preserve pad to skin contact, only to still roll the sheet back under the patient to tuck the arm. So, I don't understand that logic, but you've now created instability on two planes between the patient and the pad because you've still put the sheet back under them and you've reduced that pad to skin contact. And now you've created a slip differential of contact between the pad and the mattress.
These statistics are somewhat terrifying. Can we go back to the part where you said how many people fell off a surgical table every year? Because that just floors me. How come we're not hearing about all of those falls every year? Why don't we hear about that?
Well, one of the things that was supposed to happen during the Affordable Care Act is we were supposed to have a national patient safety database. And all of these things, OSHA, all these types of things, injuries, the National Occupational Research Agenda that OSHA and NIOSH set in place for healthcare, we don't follow them. If you look at all of their things that they're trying to improve, safe patient handling, needle sticks, slip, trip, and falls, and we can talk about slip, trip, and falls all day. All of these things were meant to be improved, and they never were. And because these things aren't readily put out in a national patient safety database, all of this stuff is hidden. All of us know it from a provider perspective because we all had near misses, as Paul discussed. As an anesthesia guy for 18 years, I've had plenty of patients, I'm sitting there holding their head on my lap. It's inappropriate because we all seem to think this is normal. It's normalization of deviance. These are the types of things that create space shuttle crashes and plane crashes because we accept these things as normal, as, it's just, it's what we got to do. They're not normal. None of these things are normal because none of these companies really went in to understand the processes. And when we look at Trendelenburg, I only need a little bit of Trendelenburg to move my internal organs away so my camera gets a good view. I don't need to stand someone 45 degrees on their head and then having to deal with respiratory complications because I can't ventilate that patient because all their organs are sitting against their diaphragm. I've got VQ mismatch. And, it's funny. There's a lot of folks out there who say that you shouldn't put a strap on a patient to hold them in place. Well, you need a strap on a patient in Trendelenburg or you're going to get a brachial plexus injury if you're using a shoulder system if you're not careful. But the rationale behind that is, well, you're going to impede the work of breathing. A 3-inch strap is still going to provide lateral thoracic expansion. It's the degree of Trendelenburg. It's all the organs sitting there. It's VQ mismatch. It's higher dead space where I'm ventilating in a gravity dependent positioning and it's going to an area where there's no blood flow because of gravity. These are all physiological things we learn in anesthesia school that people really fail to account for when we're positioning these patients. And so there's a lot of myths and legends out there that are not true.
When you talk about positioning patients and you talk about accepting things that aren't really normal, that we all accept as normal, a lot of what we accept as normal is what work we have to do to get our patients positioned for surgery. All of the heaving and the lifting and the dragging and the pulling that goes in, that's just what's normal for me at work. I mean, that's what we do. I go home with my back hurting every day because I work in orthopedics. And so, it's normal, but it shouldn't be. Do you have any statistics on employee injury based off of the extra work that we are doing when we position our patients?
So I'm going to throw in a few of these things that are out there on your show notes that the people will be able to go to, but just kind of reading from some NIH publications that are out there. But back injury from patient lifting may be the single largest contributor to the nursing shortage, with perhaps 12% of nurses leaving or being terminated because of back injury. As we stated earlier, the U.S. healthcare industry has not kept pace with other industries as it provides mechanical lift equipment and lifting load equivalents to weights of patients and all those types of things that, again, as I discussed earlier, funny enough that we're seeing in Australia and England. So we need to kind of understand that. According to the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, Occupational back injury is the second leading occupational injury in the United States. Among healthcare personnel, nurses have the highest rate of back pain with an annual prevalence of 40 to 50% and a lifetime prevalence of 35 to 80%. This is on the website when Texas passed their safe patient handling stuff. Again, there's not very many people that are doing safe patient handling in the operating room because of, technologies that force them to lift and move. But nursing is an occupation most at risk for low back pain, with rates exceeding heavy industry workforce. Furthermore, the lifetime prevalence of low back pain, again, is about 90%. Additionally, low back pain reoccurrence rates in nurses exceed 70%. In a 2001 survey containing responses from over 40,000 nurses from 5 different countries, 39% said they plan to leave their occupation within 1 year due to the physical challenges of the job.
Well, I'll tell you, we really don't have that luxury these days, do we, David?
We don't. As we discussed earlier, when you look at cost increases, you're seeing a ginormous market correction in salaries because all the nurses have left. All the providers have left because their rates are getting decreased. We're going to be in a healthcare crisis pretty soon because we're starting to see salaries go up because everybody's having to pay for someone to come in when we should have been taking care of everybody and doing the right thing in the beginning. And this is a far different discussion from patient positioning, but there's a lot of things at play that's going on right now that really we need to look at the value proposition of what we're offering our patients, and in turn, what our healthcare facilities are offering for their employees to make sure that they stay safe and provide that care.
Yeah, I've had some conversations with some workforce economists, and they've really talked about how important creating that culture is going to be for staff retention. And if you want to recruit people into the industry to do these jobs, it's going to be critically important. I think staff safety is, and yes, the bulk of today's conversation is about patient safety. But if you want a good culture that's going to be, totally geared towards employee retention, it's going to also have to be very much involved in a transparent way about employee safety. And so we might be hearing NIOSH, which you referenced there, a heck of a lot more in the next decade. And, you're right. This nursing shortage isn't going away. The crisis is here. It's just whether or not we've completely been willing to admit it. We've been talking about it for 30 years that it's coming, and now we're going to be all living through it. So, every innovation, we just don't have the luxury of not supporting new innovations to help make this, really a better, safer world for patients to receive care. And guess what? While nurses entering the industry and the workforce is going down, guess what's going up? The number of patients that are going to be coming into these facilities. So, we're really at a very critical time. David, you did a phenomenal job with this interview, and I also appreciate how much preparation you did around statistics to help everybody really, qualify what we're talking about here and really pack a punch behind the message.
Well, thank you. And if I could leave just one little quip here is, we want to make sure just all the things that you say, we want to make sure from a provider perspective that our supply chain aligns with the needs of our safety and our patient safety. And it doesn't always do that. And, today, especially in the OR, nurses and doctors have been conditioned to ask how much all the time, as if their decisions of the products that they use, even though they can be helpful, are somehow going to decrease the cost of care. And that's just simply not true. There are people being enriched way above them to stay on contract and to do all these types of things. And I'm here to let you know that nurses and doctors can get whatever they need, and there's no such thing as a contract for goods. And you can go to the Healthcare Supply Chain Association's website and look under the FAQs, and it literally says, and these are all made up by GPOs, do I have to purchase something on contract? And it says no. And by law, you don't. But it's a myth that providers, deny themselves the opportunity to look at improved devices, look at innovations, because they're scared that their decisions are going to increase the cost of care. Our $3.8 trillion annual cost of care has nothing to do with the products that you use, but it has everything to do with the poor outcomes by not embracing innovations that would improve that care.
That was David Gomez, CEO and CTO at Infinitus Medical Technologies, LLC. And Melanie, some of the stats that he threw out were really quite shocking, but I think you really highlighted it well, and so did David, about, it's just something that everybody comes accustomed to. And so, it's just, hey, this is just part of the job. This is what happens every day. And, just hearing about some opportunities, possibly for design improvements, but I don't even think I understood the physics of it all at this level of detail that he shared with us today, which, really, I'm looking forward to future conversations, but we talked about the culture piece and everything else. And it's not just about patient safety. So often nurses put their own health secondary or their own safety secondary. And really, it's equally important. Everybody's safety in that room is important. And, there's that whole other aspect that he brought forward about and statistics around, employee injuries related to patient positioning. And so great conversation today. I almost feel like there could be several, follow-up conversations on this topic over time.
I definitely think so. And his statistics and the information he shared was really enlightening, because I understand that there's employee injuries, and I know I go home hurting, but I never always maybe put together that what I'm doing every single day is part of the problem. But, in the OR, when we go to position a patient, you've got your circulator, anesthesia, the scrub tech, maybe some care techs, all these people that are moving in to come help position this patient, because we want them to be as safe as possible in their surgery. And sometimes we don't think about the body mechanics of the things that we're doing, or all of the dragging and heaving and pulling, and we're getting injured and we're getting hurt. There are devices out there. There are companies out there who are looking at ways to make it better for the patients, and it also makes it better for us. And those are really opportunities for us to explore ways to make the work environment better for all of us.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Paul and Melanie and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.